Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. I noticed that the first name was Jeff Sachs or Jeff Bezos? Sorry, I couldn't read. Now, as you know, the Greek,
Changed my name from Jeffrey Sachs to Goldman Sachs, but it's not working.
as you know, the Greek had the word pleonexia. That is a typical example in modern days of pleonexia, which is more than greed. You can be greed, but not yet. But apart from that, the point that you have raised, it's very important. As you know, one of the major problems we are facing today in our society is the following. Where to locate the surplus generated by the new technologies and the increases of productivity, which is a consequence. At the time of the first industrial revolution, the surplus shifted from agriculture to industry. We have created the so-called secondary sector. Then, at the time of the second industrial revolution, at the end of the 19th century in Germany, because the second revolution started in Germany, we moved from industry to the tertiary sector, the sector of services, and we have created primary, secondary, tertiary. Now, the question today is, since we are living in the fourth industrial revolution and the increments of surpluses is under the eyes of everybody, where do we locate the surplus? As we know, there are two options. One is neo-consumism. That is why Pope Francis, who, of course, he has a nose for these things, says that is very dangerous, because neo-consumism is a way to reproduce the whole mode. So we have to find what sometimes people call the quaternary sector, which is exactly goes in the direction of what you were suggesting. In other words, increasing the spiritual dimension of human beings. Because when we talk about culture, etc., we are referring to the spiritual dimension. On the other hand, the neo-consumistic approach insists on the material dimension, etc. And that is, in my opinion, it's a real battle of the... So I would like to know your thought about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. Rocco, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey. Fascinating. I am, however, a little bit more pessimistic. My first question is, well, do we really want most people or all the people to live out of a subsidy of the state? I think that work is good for man. And I think also that in all preceding cases of economic revolutions, all sectors have disappeared, but new sectors have emerged. What about thinking of the old idea of otium? Otium does not mean to be idle in Latin. It means all those activities that are directly mainly to the education of man. Yes. Think of theater, think of music, think of culture. Will it be produced by algorithms? Unlikely. And this is only one example. I can imagine other examples. Should we rather foster the growth of new productive sectors instead of thinking of a general subsidy? That's the first question. The second question is, what about power? Because usually the distribution of wealth goes hand in hand with the distribution of power. And how can we bring power under control? At this moment, enormous part of the benefit, you said it, of the information and communication technology are in the hands of a very restricted number of people. And these people are organizing themselves in order to take power. It is a situation very similar to what Stefano said before. In the 16th century, 16th, 17th century, great companies dominated the sea, the waves. Britannia rules the waves. They were mainly British and Holland, from Netherlands. And they had the bulk of the wealth of the world, and they were autonomous powers who imposed their will upon the states. Now we have the problem of restoring a balance in which the people may decide to tax the big business. Who can tax the big business today? Who can tax today the value created in the internet? And also not created in internet, but that goes through internet. Think of economic commerce. So here we have the problem of a world governance and of a new balance of power. The national states are incapable of doing that. Only not a government. I think we already have too much government. I would not like to have a world government. But a governance, a coalition of governments that restore the power of the states to decide on things regarding the common good. The last question is, in order to arrive to the point that you indicate, there is a transition period. In this transition period, we are likely to have goods that are produced for people who cannot buy them, and then a general collapse of the economic system. We should have a theory of transition. Should we?
Thank you. Would you prefer to reply now or the fourth? Well, you prefer if you, to have all the questions before. Professor Nofal, please.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for an excellent presentation. I have a few comments. One is the key steps for, you make a differentiation between key steps for improved lives and livelihoods and a global digital strategy. So the first question is whether the key steps are mainly principles for policy formulation at levels of national and subnational governments, and the global digital strategy is mainly for the global level. So that I wanted to understand, and if it's a global level, I think it's related to the question how we can implement some of the things. For instance, tax on big wealth, tax on wealth, on big tech. No, do we need an international agreement, which is an institution? Is the G20, could this be an issue for the G20 to talk? Well, on the key steps for improved lives and livelihoods, I think I will add in the first point, public and private financing, particularly for lifelong learning. I think education is, the government has a primary responsibility, but in training, corporations do have a responsibility. Corporations, unions, and governments. It's the three of them. This is a multi-stakeholder engagement. Then regarding the global agenda, it's going to be difficult to tax big techs and at the global level and to tax wealth, but there is one thing we can do at the global level, and I would like to your opinion. I put it at the end of my paper. We're discussing now, we're starting a discussion in WTO of a framework for an international investment facilitation agreement. That was signed in the last ministerial meeting of WTO in Buenos Aires. There was an agreement between countries to start a discussion. This is not like, investment facilitation is not like the investor treaty agreements that protect companies, investors' legal rights. The investment facilitation agreement focuses on having a predictable and transparent business environment. In my opinion, given what we know about the impact of technology, which I agree with what Jeffrey said, one is the market outcome and the other is the political outcome, but the market outcome shows a declining labor share everywhere in the world, in the developed world and in the developing world, and a shift to profits, an increase in profit share, not a capital share in traditional sense, in the profit share. So the one thing we need to do is broaden this discussion of investment facilitation and incorporate incentives, economic incentives. We should have an international agreement that we're not going to subsidize profits anymore of corporations, that whatever economic incentives are given to investment, they should be given to the labor factor. They should be given in relation to the creation of new employment and to retraining, to build the capacities of the workers. And this is very important, and it can be done if governments are really transparent, but they talk about predictability. But how are you going to have predictable macroeconomics if developing countries deteriorate their public finances, subsidizing the profits of large corporations? And if we don't have an international agreement, developing countries, it's very difficult, because if you say no, then the investment will go elsewhere. So I think this is something can be done. And related to the green economy, we should say that whatever economic incentives are given are only for sustainable foreign direct investment, for sustainable investment, not for investment that destroys the planet and destroys lives. So we can deal with two issues, the transition to a green economy and a better future of wealth. Because if we keep on subsidizing corporate profits, we deepen the inequality in the distribution of income that already it's large. So I wanted to know, because this is an issue we can push, and you can push, Jeffrey, you have a larger audience, but the discussion is started now. Already they are meeting to identify which are the critical subjects for this agreement. So we need to broaden the scope and at least ban corporate income tax exemptions.
Thank you. Now, the last one, Marcelo Suarez.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff. I have more than a question. I was wondering if you would reflect on the following. 20,000 years ago, with the emergence of Homo sapiens sapiens, until probably about 11,000 years ago, the proto-human social organization was really structured in the hunting and gathering form of evolutionary phase. So, and these were societies that were labeled, well studied in the ethnographic and the anthropological record, as the original affluent societies. It's a classic paper by Marshall Salins on who are the original affluent societies. They're not in Silicon Valley, they are in the Kung Sun of the Kalahari Desert. So in a way, there is a once and future return of a culture of leisure. Now, what's interesting is extracting the archaeology of what those societies look like, and these were societies with much greater levels of bonding capital, much greater levels of religiosity and ritual life, much greater levels of gossip and other instruments of social cohesion. So I wonder if you would reflect on this once and future social organization. The other comment I have for you is, what do you think of the idea of Jeff Bezos buying the Amazon with the fires and...
Okay. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you for wonderful comments and improvements on the basic theme. Let me start with the most basic proposition again, which is that when technology enables us to produce more with less, we potentially can benefit from that if we design the responses properly. This is the starting point. Then I want to link that with the universal destination of goods, that the basic idea is that you take a constructive approach to how that should be shared. And I think what Stefano said is a wonderful way to conceptualize that as well. I would add one more point. We went from agriculture to industry, industry to services, then services to science, because a great deal of the post-World War II period was a conscious decision, a very clever one by the United States, to mobilize science at the core of the economy. And it created a technical professional class that really didn't exist until the 1960s. The number of PhD and other advanced degree scientists was tiny in the 20s, the 30s. Vannevar Bush, who was FDR's science advisor, wrote a famous book called Science, the Endless Frontier. And the argument was what we learned in science during World War II, we can now make at the core of the civilian economy. Also, of course, the military economy going forward. But this, I think, was a third fundamental shift. It made intellectual property a core category. The idea on the final demand side of identifying a cultural sector of value of life is a wonderful idea and really helps to conceptualize what we're after. And it comes to Rocco's point also, which is I agree completely with you on your observation about culture, education, theater, and you put it better than I did. It still requires a state subsidy, so it's still the mechanism of tax, a part of that bigger pie, devoted to the fourth sector. You create jobs in that way. So it's not just a wage subsidy, it's just a big improvement in describing the idea of using a constructive redistribution approach. It happens to create jobs. I was thinking of it in a different way, which is that people would do culture, education, and theater for free because they would have the incomes to do it. But the other way is subsidies for the National Endowments of the Arts and other good things, which I think is a very, very good point. And similarly, it doesn't all have to be tax. It can be a regulation on business about job training, for example, as you pointed out. So I think all of these things are improvements in the way that I described the idea. But I do think that the basic idea is correct, that we have an opportunity here that we shouldn't be just afraid of. And that is if the machines can do things, by the way, even if they can do better economics research, God bless them. I'm happy to do something else. If the big data can forecast business cycles better, organize lectures, or read 10,000 journals with keyword index better than I can and draft papers that synthesize that, that's fine with me too. We should use these machines to stop the drudgery of going into a coal mine, the backbreaking work in agriculture, which is backbreaking in the traditional sectors. It's the hardest work on the planet, is being a farmer in a poor country. I tried it for a few hours. I could barely stand up straight again as I was weeding next to a 70-year-old woman who was weeding all day, every day for her life. But the point I'm making is that the machines can allow us to do absolutely wonderful things, but they will not produce the kind of society we want unless we consciously think about the kind of society that we want. The market, to reify the market, is just a strange idea. The idea that the market is the end arbiter is a profoundly bizarre idea, which got into some heads of British empiricists a couple of hundred years ago, and when they conquered the world, never got out of our textbooks. But we shouldn't regard economics in that way, as the free market something. So all of those improvements are absolutely I will take on board in writing this up. Then there's the political question. What is the model that I have in mind? How could this be done? Because in the one hand, it seems so hopeless sometimes. Of course they have power. How are you going to stop their power? But on the other hand, it's so absurd. There are just 15 people. We have 7.7 billion people. Why do 50, and by the way, Mark Zuckerberg lived down the hall from my daughter at school. He was probably a clever jerk then, and he's certainly a clever jerk now. Why should he have the say? over the 2 billion or 3 billion people that use that service. So I don't believe that they're so strong. I think that they're incredibly weak. They're just a few of them. And I think we need transparency to understand, to take the veil off of this, that this is just a tiny, tiny group that has, because of the power of the technology, not because of them, but because of, and they didn't invent the technology, by the way. That pleasure goes to Mr. Turing and to John von Neumann and to Kirby and to the inventors of integrated circuitry, and not any of these people we're talking about. They should not have this power, and they're not a big faction, and they don't have a big, they don't have anything but their money, which seems to me not so powerful if we get our heads put on right and understand this. In terms of how this can be done, what is true is that no individual country can tax this kind of income because it's so easy to shift. There's so much cheating, it's so easy. So of course this requires a coalition. A good starting point is the European Union, by the way, which gets it. Margaret Vestager gets it, and we should help her to get this right. The G20 is another possibility. The United Nations General Assembly, I'm going to try to work for a resolution this year on just taxation of this extra income, because we are short about $400 billion a year to get kids in school, to get health care for all, and so forth. And this could come from very small number of sources. So I'm going to work on a resolution at the UN General Assembly on this, because this can be a globally understood commitment that doesn't not have many opponents except for maybe the 15 or maybe 500 people or maybe a couple of thousand people who think they're very important, but they actually don't have anything but bank accounts. We have a lot more going for us, it seems to me. As a general matter of politics, we do need global cooperation of governments, and this is critical. I think that there are two practical ways to do this. One is at the UN level, which remains, we need to save the UN and need to make it work. The second is at the level of cooperation across regions. We have the European Union, we have the African Union, we have ASEAN. We have a few large groups. It's not even 20. It is 7 or 8 that have about 90% of the world's population in them. We should be operating at that level much more, at the level of these regional powers that can do this. Now, finally, to come to Marcelo's question, my epiphany for this, if it is an epiphany, came in a visit to Virunga National Park in Rwanda, and we went to visit the gorillas. And we stayed with the gorilla family for a few hours. They ate when they want. They just grabbed the banana off the tree. They played all day. The kids would come up, the dad would push them away, but then he'd chase them around and they'd have some games. They were having a wonderful day. I thought that's culture. Leisure, that is the band that you're talking about. It was a group of about 25 or 30, so it was probably our hominin relatives of 6 million years ago, not 200,000 years ago. But it's a pretty good life, except that we're destroying their life by destroying the bamboo forest. But the idea truly that toil, of course, in the Bible, toil is the punishment of original sin. And one could think that this is a primordial response to this puzzle of humankind. How did we end up in this terrible toil when we were living lives, because hunter-gatherers work only 2 or 3 hours a day, and the rest of the time is leisure time. And it has been a puzzle for humanity. How did we end up with working hours of 10 hours a day, 7 days a week in physical toil for 10,000 years. And it's only in the last 200 years that we're starting to escape the pure physical toil. And even Aristotle, who you know I adore, he accepted slavery because without the slaves, there would have been no philosophers. It was the life of leisure at a level of subsistence depended on brutal inequality. And he more or less, unfortunately, justified that in his way. Not completely, but partly. But the point that I would make now is that because of technology, we can actually free all of humanity from toil. We can free all of humanity from the drudgery. It's physically possible to do if we design to do it. And we shouldn't punish ourselves as thinking that the only answer is endless hard work. I think part of our language problem is the meaning of work, because we see work as a calling. We see work as dignified because, of course, we dignify human beings work, so we dignify work. But maybe that's not a fair syllogism, actually. Maybe what we want to dignify is dignified work, and we want to understand what that dignified work is. We think of dignified work as, like Aristotle in chapter 10 of Nicomachean Ethics, as life of the mind. And artists think of it as creating art, and others as being wonderful mechanics and so forth, and that's all dignity. And we should not pay people according to the market outcome, but according to human dignity. And that's no longer, not only is that not crazy or crude Marxism, that's how the best run societies in the world do it. Because in Sweden or in Denmark or in Netherlands or in Norway, most of the income of the household is not their labor market income. Half the GDP is taxed, and it provides universal services for everybody: health, education, vacation time, family leave time, free college tuition. So think of where the real income is coming from. It's universal basic income, but it's not called that. It's universal services for a decent society. And it's already happening, and they work under 3 hours a day, and they have 6 weeks vacation, and they, have a high quality of life. So that is a good window on but we're so far from that in concept, first of all. And what our prevailing ideology teaches us is something else, which is the poor are told you have to work harder. They're told that by the rich that don't work at all. This is the first point. The rich don't feel that their dignity comes from their hard labor. They don't work at all. They have legions working for them. So that's the first point. Then the poor are told you have to work harder. And then in America, because of the prosperity gospel, they're told if you're not wealthy, that's not because anyone owes you something, that's because God, you're just not trusting enough. And so we have the televangelists adding the measures of guilt and self-denial and self-attack to all of this, because the whole mode of ethics in the U.S. is if you're poor, it's your fault, and don't complain and don't expect anything. So we have to break through this ideology, but it's a paper wall, actually, because it's so egregious, the inequalities, so unjust compared to the equal distribution of human dignity, that it can't stand. And I'm not talking about violent revolution. I'm talking about just calling out, Mr. Bezos, why do you have $110 billion and want to use it to go to Mars? No. That's, I think, what our fight is.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey, for your ideas. Well, time is over. Huh? Very, very short. Very short. Just a question.
I come back to the question more or less of Buttiglione, but in another way, because Aristotle says a very interesting thing. The virtue of the good man is not strictly the same as the virtue of the good citizen. So this is very intelligent. Because the virtue of the citizen is directly to the common good. The good man, yes, but, and after say many times there are different things. A good citizen is not a good man, and the contrary. So, but in the world today that the structure no respect the idea of common good, because it's clear that the idea of good not exists more. And the common good is nothing. The politician not speak more about this. The economists not speak more about this. What is the way to come back to this idea that is really very important to arrive to the happiness of the people and to also to order in the sense that you say? Unity national, yes, but...
Yeah. I think that's exactly what we're doing here. And I believe that the work here, the work of civil economy, the work of the economy of Francesco that will be in Assisi, is a historic opportunity to revamp economic thinking, fundamentally. And I think that the fundamental idea is that is just this. Adam Smith actually wrote a very good book on the wealth of nations. And he accurately described how to create wealth. But he did not write a book called The Well-Being of Nations. And we have to write the book, The Well-Being of Nations, now, because we're after something different. And Aristotle, if Adam Smith had known Aristotle better, he would have known that even if he wrote the book on the wealth of nations, he was only writing about an instrumental objective. He was not writing about the summum bonum. He should have written about the happiness of nations. And this is the mistake that he made, but it's told in the title. He said what he was doing, he did it, it's very good, it produced wealth and unhappiness. It produced wealth and power. It produced wealth and exclusion. So, and even the greatest, it's interesting that the greatest proponents of Adam Smith have been Britain and the United States, which are two brutally exclusive societies. No country fought more wars than the United Kingdom. And the only country that is coming close and trying to overtake the United Kingdom is the United States. So it's the two most militarized countries in modern history, because that is actually part of the, quote, free market as well, which is that it is using force for wealth. Because no one could live like this without force. No one would accept this without force. And so we need to invent a new economics, not by changing a little bit here and a little bit there, but changing the purpose of economics. Because you learn the first day in economics, the purpose is maximize the individual egoistic pleasure. And what we need is an economics that says maximize the good. Start there, and then define that. And I think on the question of the difference of the virtue of the good man and the virtue of the good citizen, to my mind, this is exactly what integral ecology is trying to do. Because what Pope Francis, I think, means by integral ecology is the relationship of the individual to himself, the relationship of the individual to the other, the relationship of the individual to the state or the polity, and the relationship of the individual to the ecology, and the relationship of the individual to God. And so it's a relational problem, and it's exactly why we need to say, what is the virtue of a citizen? What is the virtue of an individual? What is the virtue of a company? What is the virtue ecologically? We don't even have the language for this right now, because Aristotle didn't provide the full language, but he gave hints. He provided two languages, the virtue of citizen and virtue of the individual, not the virtue of the corporation, not the virtue of the ecology. And so in this sense, I think we're getting closer. And I think if we take universal destination of goods, if we take eudaimonia or beatitudo as our starting point, and if we take the idea of integral ecology, the three of them make up a new economic approach. And that new economics approach can say, okay, the description of how markets operate, that's Adam Smith. But that's not the description of how society should operate, because that's not going to provide for the common good or the personal good, by the way. And so this is why we need to say the market piece, which became everything, has its specific focus. What traditional economics learned about it has some merit because it explains better how wages are set and so on. But it's not how we should live our lives. The idea to make that the end is impossible. And that's why I think we can really reinvent the concepts root and branch. And my view is that it's very ripe for this right now, because traditional economics is delivering wealth but unhappiness all over the world. It's even incapable of recognizing ecological disaster as a central principle. It's incapable of understanding addiction as a central feature of modern society. And so in this sense, we don't have to convince people of something seriously wrong. We just have to show a better way to understand these issues. And I think that the doctrines that we're talking about are the better way.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you so much for your ideas and suggestions.